Met Frank at the President's Conference earlier this year. At the time, I had a client case that had presented itself, and I started the process of determining which insurance carrier to work with and potentially connect with one of their tax advisors. And at the Vice President's Conference, Frank was introduced, and I felt that it'd be a good opportunity to connect with him, and that way he would be able to offer an unbiased approach to this potential situation.
I first met Jim Leo at a meeting we organized. He saw me present at the VP conference. I did a brief presentation just to introduce myself to the participants of that conference, and Jim and I had a coffee just to get to know each other. And we both agreed that it made sense to have a preliminary meeting before meeting the client, and it actually was about a month or two in advance of our first meeting with the client. So it was good to get to know Jim on a personal level and to realize that the two of us could work well together.
So after the VP conference, I started to work on the case with my client, and at that point I recognized that I did need some assistance in terms of dealing with the corporate tax part of the equation. So I had contacted Frank by email, and we had a follow-up phone call, and I did explain to him the case and the opportunity, and he felt that it was something that he could assist me with. So after that, we ended up, I provided him with the information that he needed, and we did have a follow-up meeting in person to go through the scenario where he was able to ask me some additional questions, and then at that point he was able to take that away and work on a proposal, which we then looked at meeting with the client afterwards.
When I meet the client for the first time, I typically like to do a fact find. I don't like bringing solutions at the first meeting. The first meeting is meant to get facts and make sure that we know exactly what it is that the client is looking for. In this case, we didn't need to do that because Jim had a very good understanding of his client's wants and needs, so it made it simple to meet the client and give him a first draft. And the first draft was very close to the final draft, and the reason that we could facilitate that was, again, because the fact find actually happened before the case ever happened between myself and Jim. Jim and I had a meeting, and I did a fact find with Jim, and Jim was able to provide the direction that we needed for me to be able to put together, as I said earlier, a first draft, a working draft for us to discuss with the client.
The next step in the process, quite frankly, was the client and I went back and forth with Frank, because the client did have some additional questions as well, and Frank was very clear in providing the answers.
And when I met with the client, the process was just ensuring that we had our facts correct. The corporate structure was a bit refined, and there was discussion as to what next steps were for us to implement the correct corporate structure. This didn't come as a surprise to any of us at the table, because it was one of the open items that we had as part of our discussion. Again, the presentation we brought was not meant to be a complete presentation, so it allowed the open discussion as to how we would structure the deal so that it worked as efficiently as possible. The amount of refinement didn't necessarily happen at the presentation level, but it happened at the calculations level. And what I mean by that is there's substantial spreadsheets that happen behind the scenes, which most clients don't ask for. Those are used for the client discussions, or I'm sorry, for the accountant discussions. And clients don't really want to get their hands dirty looking at spreadsheets. With this client, again, being a financially focused person, he wanted to see the spreadsheets, and he came back several times and asked for different alterations and different iterations of the original numbers that we began with. I gauge whether or not I'm getting through to a client based on the feedback, and every client is going to give me different feedback. The obvious one is questions. When I'm meeting with a client and presenting to them, it's not about me. I try to talk as little as possible, and I try to assess whether or not the client's understanding and is following through. In this meeting, it was extremely difficult to read John because he wasn't giving me that verbal feedback. So at a point in the meeting, I actually stopped and asked him directly to ask me questions. I challenged him on it because I needed a gauge as to whether or not this was resonating with him or it wasn't resonating with him. So I think that that's important as advisors, is to make sure that you're not doing all the talking. Make sure that you're checking in with the client and ask them to ask questions. My slides are not meant for me to dictate. My slides are meant to start the conversation. And the conversation that I want is an open conversation back and forth. I want clients to ask questions when we're going through that process. And really, my optimal presentation or meeting is most of the talking is done by them, and I'm just answering their questions. When I first saw the client, the first draft was good from a structural perspective. The surprise that we had, which was a nice surprise, is that he asked for us to redo the presentation or redo the numbers with a much higher premium. So Jim and I went in pitching or showing a $100,000 annual premium for 10 years, and the client liked the idea so much that he said, I'd like to see the same idea using $150,000 of annual premium. This $150,000 annual premium helped achieve his retirement income goal.
With the client, we ended up having approximately, I believe it was 2, maybe 3 meetings by the time we started off with the initial presentation, with a follow-up, and then finally completing the application and submitting the application. I think what the client really appreciated was the fact that there was some tax benefit in implementing this corporate strategy. I find that most individuals just don't understand the impact of owning corporately owned insurance in a corp. So Frank did a very good job of explaining, what he was currently doing, because he did have retained earnings in a portfolio within the corp, and the impact of what that investment would look like, 10 to 15 years down the road, and then compare the impact of investing in the corporate life insurance and providing the investor, or sort of the client, with an income stream at retirement without really worrying about any major investment risk. I have involved Frank in actually some additional cases after this initial one, so we're currently working on about 3, and I feel, I've been in the industry for 25 years, I have no issues with preparing an insurance case or an illustration, but understanding the individual client's tax situation in detail, it's not something that I can really do because I'm not an accountant, so bringing in someone with Frank's expertise definitely helped. I believe helps me bring that case across the finish line.
I would like to work again with Jim Leo on future deals, because from the perspective of fairness, there was never any discussion from Jim as to whether or not our deal was fair. We agreed on it up front, and we never looked back. At app writing time, it was understood. Jim had agreed to my grid from the beginning, so that was something that was water under the bridge. And just in terms of his professionalism going forward, it's nice to work with an individual that knows exactly the process that needs to happen to take the client from A to Z. I can do whatever I need to do from the technical standpoint and from the idea standpoint, but there's a lot of unspoken in a case, unspoken and very non-concrete things that have to happen. And Jim was very good at carrying the case from A to Z. Let's face it, Jim is the relationship guy here. And for this case to be settled, we require the relationship person to carry it all the way. I'm there to facilitate the sale, and that makes for a perfect partnership. So absolutely, I'd love to work with Jim on future deals.